Well, hi everybody, Mark here. Thanks for taking the time to come and have a watch of this webinar. Might just hold off a little bit just to see if anybody is going to rock up in the next few minutes. I don't want to keep you all, obviously time is precious. I've just sent out some, well, a little while ago, a few seconds ago, sent out some questions there if everybody can hear me or not. So if you have problems with audio, it's probably one of the settings inside the GoToWebinar meeting. You may need to, for example, and use the passcode if you can't get audio through your PC. All right. Well, look, I don't want to keep everybody too much longer, so I will start. And if anybody rolls up late, well, they can catch it from where we're up to. All right. Well, as I said, my name is Mark Kelly. I'm with Cadgroup Australia. I'm in the AEC side of things, so mainly dealing with Revit and BIM. I also do use 3ds Max. I've never been in the CGI industry or anything like that, but I certainly have dabbled in it and taught people 3ds Max over the years. So what we're going to talk about today is to show you that the process of getting from something like Revit into 3ds Max, to show you that sort of workflow, and also have a discussion about this Arnold rendering engine, which has made an appearance in 3ds Max in more recent versions. So we'll have a bit of a discussion about that and some of the pros of Arnold and perhaps some of the cons, and I guess compare it to the old rendering engine, which used to be in 3ds Max. Okay, so Arnold has actually been around for a while, and Arnold has actually been used fairly comprehensively, well, not comprehensively, I should say, fairly extensively in the CGI and gaming industries. Even though it's, I guess you could say it's a bit of a secret, it is actually being used by in movies and PC games quite a lot these days. So here's a game called Assassin's Creed, which was the, I guess the spark that set off the Origins Creed movie. So at least most of you will be probably aware of the movie, if not the actual game itself that it was based on. Okay, so what is 3ds Max and what can it do? Why would I want to start using it over something like Revit, for example, or whatever else you're using? What is Arnold? Why is it called Arnold? Can't answer that one, sorry. Let's compare it to the outgoing rendering engine, which was called Mental Ray. That was the one that was used basically right the way across all of the, pretty much all of the Autodesk rendering products, including Revit. In fact, it had a very simplified version of Mental Ray in it. We'll also talk about some of the things that you need to remember when it comes to licensing and so forth for the new for 3ds Max and the new rendering engine. Some things I'll point out, and just some tips, I guess, if you are thinking about starting to use 3ds Max, some tips to sort of think about to use it effectively. And we will actually have a live demonstration, so I will be juggling razor blades live during the webinar, and we'll have a look at how you go from Revit, in my case it could be Inventor or another Autodesk product, and then we'll get that into Max, Then we'll convert everything so that it works in the Arnold rendering engine, and then we'll have a look at doing a render. Okay, so what's 3ds Max? Well, it's a very powerful multi-use package that's used by people from architectural rendering right the way through to CGI and gaming. It's very, very powerful, and it can be used as just a simple package to do still renders or animated renders, or it can be used to do incredibly complex sort of computational special effects like water droplets and things melting and so forth. So it does have a place in the CGI and the gaming industry, primarily for modeling of environments. So I think Jason Bourne movie, I think the second one, there was a scene that was in, I think it was set in one of the ex-Russian countries, and there was a scene in a courtyard, and the entire courtyard was actually done in 3ds Max. It was actually CGI, for example. Things like character animation tend to be done in other packages like Autodesk Maya. Okay, so you can use models from a multitude of sources. The amount of you can bring in the 3ds Max is pretty massive. And you can also create links to Autodesk products. So in my case, I'll be looking at Revit, but you could create a link, for example, to other Autodesk products out there. Now, one thing about 3ds Max is it's very, very powerful, and I guess like most things that are very, very powerful, they do require a bit of learning or training to be able to harness them effectively. All right, here's another example of a movie that used Arnold. So these days, of course, with the of CGI in movies, it's sometimes a case that the only things that are in the scene that are in the rendered frame that are real are the actors. And in the case of this movie, some of the actors weren't even really there either. They were motion capture with rendering. It's getting very, very hard to pick the boundary between what's real and what's being computer generated, which I guess means that the CGI industry knows what it's doing. So Arnold is being used extensively, as I mentioned. Okay, so what is Arnold? Well, it's a non-biased rendering engine. Now, that is a technical term. From an end user point of view, all you really need to know is that it does make quick, effective, predictable renders a lot easier than some of the other rendering engines, such as Mental Ray. It's a lot simpler to set up and use compared to Mental Ray. In fact, there's another rendering package that is a third-party package that can be purchased called V-Ray, that a lot of people who use 3ds Max end up purchasing, and that's because it was simpler and more predictable than Mental Ray, so they actually purchased that as a sort of an add-on rendering package. I would suggest that with Arnold, we now have a rendering engine built in the 3ds Max, which compares very favorably with V-Ray, and in some cases may even be simpler to set up and use than V-Ray. So what you've now got is a free rendering engine built in that I would say will probably start replacing, start usurping V-Ray's sort of usage to some respect. Okay, one of the other cool things is, as we'll see during the demonstration, is that when you do a render, Arnold will pretty quickly give you quite a rough preview of the rendered frame. Now, in Mental Ray, that preview could sometimes take a considerable length of time to come up on the screen. And so the great thing about this preview, this fast and rough preview, is that you can see the amount of light in the rendered image and whether that's effective or not, and you can see the textures quite roughly. So it gives you a preview straight away without having to wait around for possibly an hour or two, which could have been the case in Mental Ray. Of course, with the change of rendering engine, you do need to start using slightly different workflows and techniques. Learning curve, though, on Arnold is probably going to be anywhere near as large as it would be on Mental Ray, though. There's another game that's been created using Arnold. You can see the atmospheric effects in there, which you can use. Mental Ray had those as well, but and V-Ray has them, of course, but Arnold has a full complement of atmospheric effects, whether that be lighting or fog and smoke and so forth. Okay, so how does Arnold work? Well, Arnold uses what are referred to as physical lights and physical materials. As the name suggests, those objects are designed to work as closely as possible the way that real-world lights and the real-world materials actually work. There's also obviously special effects, as I mentioned, and by taking the lights and taking the energy from those light sources, complete with all the physical qualities of the light, it then bounces that off the physical materials and then alters the light as it bounces off those materials, and then obviously the intensity reduces as it bounces off them. And this all comes together to create an image. Now inside the actual, so when you bring in something like a Revit project and link it in, it brings in a sun and a sky. So in Revit, when you go in there and you adjust the time of day, for example, in a particular view, you are in fact adjusting the sun, and if you rotate true north, you're in fact adjusting what's referred to in 3ds Max as a compass that sets where true north is. There's a virtual sky inside Revit, and that comes in. It's like a dome that emits light. It comes into the 3ds Max scene. So I'm using the word scene there, just to clarify. That is the 3ds Max terminology for, I guess you'd say, a project. It's referred to as a scene. So that sky is useful because it provides light, obviously. And also when you change the position and time of the sun, then that actually affects the sky as well automatically. So it changes the color of the sky and the intensity of the light coming off the sky. We also have physical cameras, and those cameras mimic real photographic or cinematographic cameras. So they do have some quite cool little effects in them that mimic the way that real cameras work. And I guess that's another reason why, for example, the CGI guys are using the Arnold rendering engine, because those sort of effects that fool the eye into thinking that it's a real camera are reasonably easy to implement in Arnold. Okay, so when we bring in something like a Revit model or another Autodesk model or even a DWG file, we convert the materials, lights, and cameras in that project into Arnold physical ones. And there's a script, a special function inside 3ds Max that allows me to do that really quickly. Here's another movie that used Arnold. Now, despite what people thought of the plot, CGI was good. Okay, so how is it different to Mental Ray? Just quickly, as I've sort of alluded to before, Mental Ray, it was a lot more complex. Getting consistent results in Mental Ray was often very, very difficult, and it was always pretty much the lighting that got you. Excuse me. Outdoor daylight scenes were quite easy, but when you started to get into things like interior renders, getting consistent and a nice lighting effect was often quite difficult. And also, the consistency was a problem. So if you're doing an animation and you're moving through a building and you had, say, 2,000 frames, it was quite possible that, out of those 2,000 frames, most of them would be fine, but then just every once in a while there'd be a frame where the light wouldn't be quite right, which was a complete pain, as you can imagine, for someone who's creating an animation. So that's where Arnold sort of trumps mental ray in that respect. Also, with these interior scenes, as I mentioned before, getting the lighting was quite correct was quite difficult, but it also required you to use rendering techniques, and those rendering techniques were often prone to creating artifacts. So it meant that in order to get around these sort of weird lighting effects that you get with the indirect lighting, uh, you would have to then increase the quality settings quite high, which of course then meant that the renderings would take quite a long time, and renders could be very, very slow. Okay, so just a few things to remember when it comes to licensing. And first of all, 3ds Max is already in most of the industry collections, and as a function of that, Arnold is already in your collections. So that's nice. As I said before, training is highly recommended, but of course there are a lot of resources out there that you can tap into. Now, Mental Ray and Arnold allow you to take a render and render to multiple computers at once, sometimes referred to as a render farm. You can still do that in Arnold. The difference being, that it's really important to sort of remember this if you do consider doing it, is that with Mental Ray, you could just install 3ds Max on, say, 50 computers, and you didn't have to register them. Now, with Arnold, unfortunately, you have to purchase a copy of the Arnold rendering engine, not 3ds Max. Well, I guess it is 3ds Max, but you're purchasing a license, I guess, of Arnold as a function of that on each one of those rendering computers. So that is something to be aware of. So as I mentioned, I'm going to risk life and limb, and I'm going to do a live demonstration. There's always risks with these. You can practice these 100 times, and everything goes fantastically. And then you do a live demonstration, and then suddenly the wheels fall off. It does happen. So here we go. Drum roll, please. Okay, so I'm in Revit. That's a Revit project. It's got some fairly decent materials in there, but nothing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into 3ds Max. This is 2019. I'm going to go to the import link Revit. You can see you can also link AutoCAD files as well. So I'm going to go link Revit, and here's one I prepared earlier. This is actually the Revit file itself. So I'll just open that up. So when we're linking the file in, as the name suggests, this is a link or an XREF. And the beauty of this is that if I'm working on a live Revit project, it means that if I'm doing a render or an animation, I can actually refresh the link over time and get the latest version of the Revit model. Now, one of the other cool things is, though, that if I start making changes to materials, link, I can actually tell 3ds Max to ignore the materials from the Revit project and defer to the ones that I've created inside 3ds Max. There's also some really cool things you can do in Max. For example, I can take an object and I can manipulate its shape or size. I can move objects in a non-destructive way. So I can use what's called a modifier, for example, and change the shape of a wall or move the wall. And it doesn't affect the model. It's non-destructive. I can switch that modifier on or off. And so that means that if I do refresh a link and that wall has changed length and height or whatever, that modifier will still be applied to that same object. So that's pretty cool. All right, just before I go on here, I'm just going to make sure that I click Do Not Combine Entities. There are some presets here about the way that objects get combined. I would always recommend saying Do Not Combine. Okay, so we just wait for a second. let it have its think. Okay, now I mentioned before about that sun and sky that comes in from Revit, and here's a little prompt that says that you're about to bring in a sun and sky system. And then we'll just close that dialog. So there is my Revit model. Doesn't quite look, I guess, the way it might have looked in Revit, but there it is. That object there with the sort of compass is the actual sun system itself, my topography, etc. Okay, before I go any further, I am going to save this. Being a little bit paranoid, but okay, so I will come in here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I am actually going to convert everything from Revit into Arnold. And all I really need to do is just open this dialog and hit convert scene. I might get some scripting errors popping up. Okay, that's done. That took next to no time, which is interesting. So I'll just come in here. I'm going to set the rendering engine. By default, it sets itself to Art, which is another type of sort of very quick render engine. This one, Arnold, is a lot more photorealistic. I'll just come in here and change the actual rendered frame size. So I'm changing it to HDTV, which is what the majority of televisions use, that aspect ratio. And instead of making it the sort of standard HDTV, I'll just reduce it a little bit just to make the renders a bit faster for this demonstration. Just come in here and I'll just make sure I click this little button here as well. That allows the Arnold rendering engine to use images that have come in from Revit, the older versions of Revit. Okay, so I've got that. Next thing I'll do is I will go to this camera view. This is an external camera view. I'm just going to go here and I'll say show save frames. So what 3ds Max is now doing is showing me what I'm actually going to see in my rendered frame. Okay, a few other little bits and bobs. I'm going to select the camera and turn off clipping. Actually, I'm not 100% convinced that that scene converter. There it is. Wow, thank goodness I checked. So there might be some scripting errors. It just didn't seem to take very long to do, and when something goes really quickly like that, it's it's always a source of suspicion, isn't it? I had a little button tick there that said apply only to selected objects. I had nothing selected, so it didn't convert anything. So thank goodness I checked. Okay, so just waiting for it to have a little bit of a think. And yes, there you go. It's done its thing, thank goodness. Okay, so again, let me just make sure the engine hasn't yet changed to art. Of course it has. Dear. Okay, so I'll just click that little button again. I think the aspect ratio shouldn't have changed, so that's all good. So here we are. We've got, you know, I haven't really done anything to really set this up terribly well, this render, but we'll just use this. We'll just use this camera as it is out of Max, out of Revit. I'm just going to rename this so I can find it again later. Okay, so that's straight out of Revit, and what we might do is in fact just do a really fast rough and ready. Okay, it's inky darkness, and I think that's because if I were to click on the sun and have a look at the time, it's actually set to 2 in the morning. Okay, so interesting, because it was set to 2 in the morning, it actually was nighttime, which is pretty cool. So, whoa, there you go, that's awesome. Well, not a problem. What I need to do is come here to the exposure control. So the exposure control settings, I guess, in a way, look a little bit like possibly what you might see on a camera. That's just going to be white. So I'll make this something like minus 5.5. You can see I've got some controls here that allow me to control highlights, midtones, and shadows. If you do anything inside Photoshop, then those controls will probably mean a little bit to you. Let's just reduce that down a bit. That's going the opposite way. Sorry, I'll get it right. Okay, so let's do that quick render again. And this is just out of the box from Revit, and it should look pretty close to what we would see inside Revit. Now, this is what I was talking before about this preview. This is just a very, very rough preview that's coming up here. You can see it says preview pass. And it's giving me a pretty good indication of the lighting, shadows, materials, the sky, and I can use that really as a way of determining whether I'm on the right track. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone this, and I'll just bring this out of the frame and sit it over the monitor for the time being, and we'll use that as a sort of a before and after shot. So is before we go any further, is I'm going to change the sun to be set to manual. I'm going to drag that around so it's facing the opposite end of the house. I'm going to grab the sun itself and just drag it really close down to the horizon. So what this is actually going to do is it's actually going to simulate sunset. Okay, so it doesn't look quite as obvious as it could do. So what we'll do is we'll come in here. Now that the settings for the sun and the sky are all contained inside this setting here called environment. So there's an environment object in there. And what I'm actually going to do is I've got here what's called a material editor, right? So that picture this almost like an artist's palette. You can come on here, you can grab materials out of the scene and grab them and look at them and manipulate them, or I can make new materials and drag them from the editor into the scene. But also take things like this and drag them over onto an empty slot, and then I can start to work on them. So what I'm going to do is reduce the intensity of the sky quite considerably, reduce the intensity of what's called the sun disk. So that's actually a sort of an object inside the scene. You can see there that's the sun object itself. It represents the sun. And I think we can pretty much leave the rest as it is. So you can see here, even in the preview, it's automatically updated to sort of reflect those changes. It's not totally accurate though. It really only gives you a sort of a ballpark figure, but it's still pretty useful to use as a way of working out whether you're on the right track. So I'll just adjust that compensation there a little bit. Okay, so let's have a really, really quick render. Okay, so what we've got is you know, the sun, as you can see, setting in the background, and it's actually affecting the color over the horizon. So I'm happy with that. So we'll leave that part. And now what we want to do, excuse me, is just quickly show you how we can sort of manipulate the properties of the materials. So I'll pick an empty slot, grab this little dropper and grab that wall there. So interestingly, as you're well aware, inside Revit, your walls have multiple layers of material. That's brought over into 3ds Max. Each one of those materials is assigned its own unique identification. So on the face of that geometry, each face of the geometry has basically a different ID. So I think it's number 2 is the outside face of that wall. So if I click on that one, that allows me to go in and inspect that material. Now at the moment, the material on that wall I think is like a timber veneer. If I click here, you can see the image that's being used on that timber cladding. Okay, so actually let me just save this again, being paranoid. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that image and I'm actually just going to override it just to quickly show you that process. So I'm going to use a bitmap. It's called a bitmap, but really it's any image map, raster, image, PNG, JPEG, bitmap, GIF, and so forth. So I'll click OK. That's going to open up a dialog here. And I'm going to come into Material Libraries. I'm going to grab, I've just put in some image maps here. I'm just going to grab this one called Masonry Stone. I'll click this little button, and that previews in the viewport what I'm actually going to get on that finished material. So I'll just put in here 300 by 300, and you can see that I've now got some what looks like large tiles there, or stone, perhaps veneer. So that's that image map there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this. I'll just copy that. So those of you who have used rendering packages will know what a bump map is, but just as a quick explanation, a bump map is an image that's used on a material that is used to create, I suppose you'd say, pseudo texture or depth. So it's used in Revit, for example, in all the masonry, all the brick walls, or use a bump map to give that suggestion of depth. It's not real, it doesn't actually give real depth, but it does give the illusion of it. So I'm just going to paste the image that I used for the image map, this one up here, and I'm going to paste that in so it's identical to the one that's being used in the bump map. Now, technically you're not supposed to do that, but I think I can live with myself doing that. Okay, so that's that. We'll just move on a little bit, and I'm going to grab this wall down the bottom. So now the cool thing is that inside Max, when you're using Arnold, physical material presets. So I'm just going to pick a satin paint. As you can see, it's a pretty glary color. So let's make that something a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. I guess you can not please everybody, but I'll make it something like that. So a dull gray, like so. If there's a color that you really like, you can actually use the picker, and you can actually pick that color from the viewport. So I'll just cancel that. Oh no, pick OK. Okay, so that's the base color. And what I'm going to do though is I'm just going to use, it's basically I'm going to try and make this look like a rendered brick. So that's the paint color itself. Now we've got this setting here called metalness, or I guess the other terminology is glossiness. So anything that's 0 is completely matte. So I guess you could say that any light that hits it is refracted randomly 100%. 0.5, which is halfway along the scale, is like a semi-gloss. And 1, which is the highest amount of metalness, is a perfect mirror. So you might see in the preview here, if I change this to say 0.5, once this updates, the reflections will be a little bit more diffused. And then if I change it to 0, they should be completely diffused across the object. So that's I guess a simulation of the way that objects that scatter light, and that's a property. Okay, so just moving down, what I'm going to do to give that suggestion of brickwork, I'm going to use an image, but one of the cool things here is that I can actually use what's called a procedural map. In other words, I don't have to find an image of some tiles or brickwork that matches exactly what I'm trying to simulate. I can actually use a mathematically created tile. You can see if I just activate that, you can see the tile here. So let's just make that, say, 150 by 75. It's probably, actually, let's see. Yeah, that's it. The other way around, sorry. Okay, so that's, I'm not going to labor over that and try and make it exactly right. But inside the controls for the actual tile itself, I can go in here and make some tweaks. There's all sorts of stuff I can do. I can actually add in a little bit of roughness, so we don't expect brickwork to be perfectly smooth around the edges, so I can add in a small degree of roughness around the edges. So what that's going to do is it's going to give a suggestion of in the finished material, rendered brick with that base color with a slight gloss, and then that tile image or brick image is going to be, it's going to have a sort of an illusion of depth. All right, so I'll just keep working through here. I'll try and keep the talking down to a minimum. But this is the grass that came in from Revit, and I'm going to again give this an illusion of depth, but at the moment it's set to the same image map as the, sorry, it's set to the same map as the image, but in this case, I'm going to use another procedural map called noise. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I don't want to sort of get bogged down too much, but that's just going to create sort of random noise, which is going to give it the illusion of height to some degree. Okay, so that's that. Moving on, if I just grab the feet here, I'm just going to make that something like, you can see there's a, different types of materials here. We've got automotive paint, different types of metals, glass, frosted glass, clear glass, non-metallic, concrete, and so forth. So I'm actually going to just use, excuse me, something like a matte aluminium. So I could, for example, if I wanted to propagate that through the project, I can just grab, for some reason it's not letting me do that. I can propagate that through the project, there you go. It's happy with me. Okay, that's it. So that's just a quick way of I guess, also taking materials and propagating them. Whoops, let's go back, I want to do that. All right, so I'm not going to get too bogged down here. Okay, so that's just a quick look at the material aspect of things. The lighting aspect of things, if we sort of look at that, we need to just look at the rendered frame, sorry. So that's the rendered frame that I created before. Again, I'm actually going to make a clone of that one, just for reference. I'll just drag that away. So a few things about this that sort of stand out, I guess, and that's the fact that we've got the light coming from the sun, but really there's no light internally. And what we're going to do is just going to set a filter so that the only thing that I can select is lights, just to make it a bit easier. And I'm going to grab, try that again, that's better. I'm going to grab one of these lights. That's it. I'll just drag that over. Again, I won't go too much into the technicalities of what I'm doing here. It's something that if you want to start using 3ds Max, you can start to look into a bit more. I'm just increasing the intensity of the light there, and I'm just changing it from a glow into a spotlight. Reset the intensity again. So I'm just going to make some copies of this. And just drag that over. And just make sure that I've got that at the right height and the right location, which I don't. So I'll just drag a few of those across. Oh. You can see they're on an angle, so yeah, that's not good. I could adjust that if I wanted to, but just conscious of running out of time. So I'll go back to that render again, and so those lights should now be a lot more intense. And they, sorry, not more intense. Those ones are new lights, but these lights here, I'm going to make a lot more intense. Now, those are not real amounts of illumination that you'd expect to get from a real light. I appreciate that. There is a little bit of artistry involved with 3ds Max. Okay, we're not strictly going for reality here. We're going for something that looks appealing. If you're trying to sell an idea to someone, it's not like you're lying. You're just essentially setting it up in the same way that professionals set things up. They're not going to just accept what's there when they rock up. They're going to make adjustments to lighting and so forth. Okay, very quickly. There are some basic trees that ship with 3ds Max. These are quite old sorts of trees. I mean, when I say old, I mean they've been around forever inside 3ds Max. So they're fairly basic, but you know, you can actually purchase these as a you can purchase trees. There's an ArcVision, for example. You can purchase trees off them. They actually work inside Revit as well, which is pretty cool. So that means that you can use the same RPC trees in Revit and then open up the project in Max, and basically they're the same deal. So I'm just adding some randomness into those trees. Probably should really change the sizing as well, shouldn't I? Just to make it look a little bit nicer. Okay. So let's have a look to see what we get. And fingers crossed. I'll just do a very rough render. Let's see whether we're on the right track. Okay. Well, that's looking better. So you can see internally you've got some light happening. You can see those spotlights that I put there are casting light on that top deck, and you can see the light here on the front. You can see the foliage popping up. It's very basic, and I probably want to adjust it a little bit. But that's sort of I guess you could say that's a bit of an improvement when you consider that we started off with that. I'm sort of now looking at something like that. You can see that's instantly sort of really created a bit more appeal. Now, one of the things that's happening here is that the amount of light is not really it's not being bounced around very much. So these settings here are pretty much from a beginner's point of view, are pretty much all you need to really adjust. inside Arnold, which is the cool thing. So I'll really quickly go through that. This AA setting here is the crispness of the textures and the smoothness of the edges. So if I want to make things smoother and edges smoother, I can adjust that up. The amount of light that gets cast around inside the render is adjusted here. The amount of scattered light is adjusted here, and the amount of light that passes through transparent objects is adjusted here. These are the qualities, so as you increase the quality of the light, you get less artifacts, but it does take longer to render. So let's just quickly kick this off again. So what you can see, hopefully, is that the amount of light inside the interior now has greatly increased. So it's doing more processing, and it's casting that light around internally. So doing something like that in Mental Ray would have been quite computer intensive and taken some time. So you can see that just by adjusting those settings quite quickly, I've actually been able to really increase the quality. So if I just come back here, I just want to show you a comparison, perhaps to give you, I guess, some quantitative difference. On the left, I've got a Mental Ray render that I did quite a few years ago of this exact same model. And on the right, I've got an Arnold render. Now, one of the things I didn't touch on for time is that you can actually create a customized background. So the sky itself can be a customized image. In fact, it can even be an animation, which is really cool. So in both those instances, I've used a customized background. In the right-hand side image, I've put a lens flare inside Photoshop, so that's just a special effect. But to give you an idea, on the left, we've got 18 hours plus a little bit of Photoshop. On the right, we've got 7 hours. So that's a considerable time saving. And also, I guess, setting up, that's only 18 hours of rendering. That's not including the actual setting up of the lighting, the materials, and then getting the actual lighting to the finished render, which is considerably more intensive inside Mental Ray. Okay, so talk to your reseller about training if you are interested, but also remember that there's plenty of YouTube videos and blogs. Because Arnold is relatively new, there's still a lot of interest in it, so there's still a lot of people blogging and doing experiments, and the actual rendering engine is actually being adjusted and tweaked all the time. If you are making changes and experimenting, just do one change at a time, and make a note of what you change in case you break something, and have fun. So I'd just like to thank everybody for taking the time to watch. Now, if for about, say, 5 minutes, I can open up. If anybody's got a question, feel free to ask. We've actually got about 10 minutes left. Any questions, please feel free to ask. I may have stunned everybody into silence. I think Ted might have had a look. Oh, okay. So the question was, what was the camera tab? Okay, so when you select the camera, this here is like a properties window that allows you to adjust the properties of the selected object. So I can come in here and make changes to the physical properties of the actual camera itself. Are there any educational versions of 3ds Max for TAFEs? Yes. I believe the entire, pretty much the entire Autodesk software, except for probably some of the cloud-based services should be available as education versions. So yeah, that was Hamed that asked that question. Okay, Arnold versus V-Ray. Charles has asked about that. I would suggest that I think at this point in time, Arnold is slightly slower on some types of renders. The rendering engine's being updated all the time. So I think Autodesk, they own Arnold. And they're really, really keen to make it as good as possible and to make it as commercially attractive as possible. So, you know, they probably do. They might not say it in as many words, but they'd certainly love to be able to sort of get back V-Ray and get people to use Arnold instead. So, you know, if the rendering times are a little bit different at the moment, then working on making the algorithms better so that the renders are faster. Okay, Alison, is for linking Revit to 3ds Max, if there are changes made in 3ds Max to the model, how does that work for Revit? Okay, well, it doesn't work backwards, but if, for example, I were to take that object there, this editable mesh, I can actually move it like so, and that doesn't affect the actual Revit model. There's no sort of interconnectivity between the two. But one of the really cool things is if I come in here, I can do things like this, for example. Okay. And this is where things start to really get quite dynamic. So I can do things like that, really simple animations where things move away from each other or rotate or change shape, change size and so forth. And those are actually reasonably simple to do, but that won't affect the Revit model per se. If I did want to update the link, I think no, actually, where is it? I think it's on Manage Links. There it is. So I can reload that, I can detach it, I can embed it or bind it. And when I do reload, there's different settings here about what I want to do. Like, do I want to keep material assignments and so forth? Just very quickly, from a quality point of view, I would suggest that Arnold is pretty much up there with V-Ray. The comparisons I've seen are comparing Arnold to Mental Ray, and I think Mental Ray actually is the tougher thing to compare to, because despite the fact that Mental Ray is more difficult to use, it does have the edge in terms of photorealism. So I've seen Arnold compared quite favorably. So I would suggest that it's pretty much on a par with V-Ray in terms of quality. Okay, well, I think that probably wraps it up. I can't see anybody else asking questions there. So again, I'd really like to thank everybody for taking the time out to, an hour is a big chunk of the day. I hope everybody got something out of this, whether it just be for out of interest or inspiration, or perhaps motivation to start looking at 3ds Max. And I'd like to thank you all. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate to contact your business development manager inside Cadgroup if you want to start talking about example. And this webinar will also be available on a link. So if you do want to share it with anybody in your office, for example, or come back and watch it again, then you'll be able to get that link. Just very quickly, two last questions. Can render in the cloud be used with Arnold? Well, actually what happens is you can render in the cloud from 3ds Max. I'm not sure which rendering engine it uses, to be honest, but it's a lot quicker than rendering. The quality isn't quite as good. So it is another option that you can use perhaps to do preview renders. You can render in the cloud from 3ds Max, and that uses cloud points, of course. Is Arnold included in the AEC collection? Yes, it's included inside 3ds Max. It's part of a free license, effectively. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you very much, and we'll leave it there. And as I said, if anybody wants to get hold of this, they can ask us at Cadgroup, and we can provide you with a link if you want to watch the game. Thank you, guys. Catch you later.